Ever wondered how ordinary people actually survived each day in the 1700s? A world with no engines, no buzzing lights, no rush. Just quiet hands, steady routines, and days shaped completely by nature. Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey with Go to Sleep Historian. Thank you for joining us tonight. Your time here truly means a lot. In this calm, slow-moving story, we step into the everyday world of the 1700s, a world where farmers rose with first light, bakers worked beside cooling embers, blacksmiths shaped iron through heat and patience, weavers spun threads into the fabric of daily life, and merchants, sailors, and fisherfolk carried news and goods between distant villages. These people, quiet, hard-working, kept their communities alive long before machines ever existed. Their days moved at the pace of seasons, and their nights belonged completely to silence. As you listen, allow yourself to settle in. Let your breathing slow, your shoulders ease, and your mind drift gently into the calm rhythms of the past. And if you enjoy peaceful history told in soft, soothing ways, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these restful journeys. Reminder: when the spoken story comes to an end, gentle relaxing music will continue on its own, guiding you softly toward deeper rest and helping you drift into sleep without interruption. Now, let us begin how ordinary folks earned a living in the 1700s. A peaceful walk through the lives, routines, and small everyday moments that shaped a world now long past, yet still full of warmth, patience, and quiet wisdom. A village falls asleep, entering the 1700s tonight. We begin our slow drift into the 1700s, into a world without streetlights, without phones buzzing, without engines growling, without anything that could rush a person through their evening. It is a world where the night is allowed to be quiet, allowed to stretch, allowed to breathe. And you, listener, are stepping into this quiet world as gently as a foot falls on soft moss. Picture this: a tiny village tucked somewhere in old Europe. The exact country doesn't matter. This kind of village could have belonged to England, France, Germany, Ireland, or even early America. But for tonight, imagine it as a place just far enough from the nearest town that the roads feel like soft, winding ribbons trailing through forests and fields. A place where people know every door hinge, every creaky floorboard, every chicken by sound alone. A place where the night belongs entirely to the sky. The village is already falling asleep as you arrive. The cobblestone path is uneven, worn smooth in places by centuries of footsteps, but still a little rough under your boots. Lanterns hang from wooden hooks near a few doors, their flames low and steady. The glow is a soft amber, nothing startling, nothing bright enough to chase away dreams. It only lights small circles on the ground, like warm puddles of honey pooling at your feet. A breeze wanders through the narrow street. Not a strong wind, but a gentle, wandering breath of air carrying the smell of earth kissed by dew. It carries another smell, too, something warm, faint, and comforting. The smell of bread that was baked hours ago and is still lingering in the air like a sleepy memory. You hear almost nothing. That's the strange thing about nights from centuries ago. No engines, no humming wires, no buzzing billboards. Even the animals understand that nighttime belongs to silence. A cow shifts softly in its wooden stall. A dog gives a single slow thump of its tail against a doorstep before deciding sleep is more important. Somewhere, an owl calls once just one's hand, then settles into the quiet again. You stop at the village gate. Calling it a gate might be generous. It has more of a wooden door with iron hinges that squeak even when you breathe too close to them. But it stands there proudly anyway, as if it really believes it's guarding something important. You push it open. It creaks a long, slow groan that echoes just a little. Not enough to wake anyone, but enough to let the night know you have arrived. Stepping through, you realize the village is smaller than you thought. Just a cluster of cottages, each one thatched or timbered, each one leaning slightly one way or the other from years of rain and snow. Every roof has its own personality. Some dip gently in the middle, some curve upward at the ends, and some are covered in moss so thick it looks like the house is wearing a soft green cloak. A church bell in the distance rings once. Not an urgent ring, just the 9th hour of the night, letting anyone awake, though hardly anyone is that. It is now truly time for sleep. The bell is deep and low, and its vibration fades slowly, weaving itself into the fabric of the night air. As you walk further in, you reach the village square. Unlike modern squares with neon signs or pavement, this one is simple, peaceful. In the center stands a stone well, its rope coiled neatly beside the bucket. The stone is worn smooth by hundreds of hands, hundreds of years. It has heard every kind of morning greeting, every tired sigh, every whispered hope. But tonight it listens to the soft rhythm of nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just the quiet breathing of a village tucked into sleep. To the left of the well sits the bakery, a squat stone building with a low doorway. Even now, with its fire long dimmed, you can smell wheat and warmth. The baker will wake long before 10 hours before even the roosters consider crowing. But for now, the oven cools in the shadows, and the baker sleeps under a heavy blanket, probably dreaming of loaves rising perfectly or dough that behaves for once in his life. Next to the bakery is the blacksmith shop. You can almost feel the echoes of hammer blows that filled the air earlier that day. Metal on metal, heating its cold. Strength meeting strength. Now, the place is still. The tools hang quietly from the walls, each one in its rightful place. The forge rests, its ashes soft and gray. A tiny wisp of smoke curls from the chimney, the last sigh of a hard day's work. Across the square is the weaver's cottage. A lamp burns faintly behind a window, just a soft glow. Perhaps she hasn't quite finished her final row of thread, but even she is slowing down, her loom silent now, her shuttle still. The scent of wool lingers, a warm, comforting smell like blankets warming by the fire. You take a slow breath. Everything feels hushed. Even the stars hang low, as if they, too, are dozing. You begin walking again, your boots brushing softly against the cobblestones. No one comes to the windows. No one whispers. The whole village trusts tonight to hold it safely. And as you pass, you realize something beautiful. This world survived on these quiet nights. Not on battles, not on royal decrees, not on political drama, but on steady routines, early mornings, and homes lit by single candles. On people who worked not for fame, but simply because work fed them, clothed them, warmed them. Tomorrow, these villagers will rise with the sun. The farmer will shoulder his plow. The baker will knead his dough. The blacksmith will strike sparks that dance briefly in the air. The weaver will draw her shuttle across a loom that whispers its own ancient song. But tonight, they sleep, wrapped in wool blankets that smell faintly of smoke, dreaming beneath roofs that have sheltered generations, resting in the deep quiet that the 1700s offered so generously. You pause in the square one last time. Look around. The lantern flickers. An owl calls again, distant and gentle. The air cools against your skin, and you feel it, a village asleep, timeless and unhurried. A world settling into silence. A perfect beginning to our long, sleepy journey. The farmer's dawn, work woven into the earth. Dawn arrived slowly in the countryside of the early 1700s. The light crept over the fields in a pale gray wash, softening the edges of the world before the sun fully rose. Most of the village was still asleep, tucked beneath blankets or curled near fading hearth fires. But the farmer's day began before almost anyone else stirred. On a small farm just beyond the village boundary, a man pushed aside his wool blanket and sat up. His movements were careful, not because he was trying to be silent, but because his body carried the stiffness that came from years of repetitive labor. He rubbed his eyes, ran a hand over his face, and listened for a moment to the familiar sounds inside the house. The crackle of the embers, the faint breathing of his wife still half asleep beside him, and a child shifting under a blanket across the room. The room itself was simple, a single space, divided only by a curtain and a few pieces of furniture. The walls held the smell of smoke, wool, and earth. Everything inside served a purpose. Everything had been used, mended, or repurposed more times than anyone could easily count. The farmer quietly pulled on his worn boots. The leather was cracked at the edges, softened by years of mud, frost, and long days in the fields. Once dressed, he stepped outside into the cold morning air. His breath turned white as it rose toward the dim sky. The farm around him was still half asleep. The ground shimmered slightly with dew, and the fields stretched out in muted colors, the crops yet to catch the first real sunlight. A rooster called in the distance, loud and confident, as if the bird believed it controlled the sunrise. A cow inside the barn gave a long, slow exhale, as though reminding him that she, too, waited for breakfast. He walked to the well first. His boots thudded quietly on the packed earth, the only significant sound in the early quiet. At the well, he lowered the wooden bucket into the dark water and pulled it back up with steady arms. The water splashed into a trough for the animals, breaking the stillness for a moment before settling again. Inside the house, his wife had risen. She moved through the kitchen area without hurry, adding small pieces of wood to the fire and stirring the pot of porridge that would serve as breakfast. The steam from the pot lifted slowly, warming the air around her hands. Their morning routine did not require much speaking. They had been doing this for years, and the rhythm of it required no reminders. Once the animals were watered, the farmer stepped into the barn. The cows blinked at him in the dim light, their breath rising in soft clouds. Chickens clucked lazily from their roosts, still barely awake. He fed them all hay for the cows, scraps and grain for the hens. The simple tasks of early morning were never rushed. Each step ensured that the animals would remain healthy, productive, and calm throughout the day. Soon, he walked toward the fields, with the sky now a lighter shade of gray. The wooden plow leaned against a fence post, waiting for him just as it always did. He checked its beam and metal blade, ensuring nothing had cracked since the previous afternoon. Nearby, 2 oxen stood patiently, their large bodies warm in the cool air. They snorted softly when he approached, as if greeting him out of habit. He tightened their harnesses with practiced motions. The oxen lowered their heads, accepting the routine without complaint. This partnership man and animal had shaped farming for centuries. Machines had not yet transformed agriculture, and most work depended entirely on human strength, animal endurance, and steady effort. Once everything was ready, he took hold of the plow handles and guided the oxen forward. The plow bit into the soil with a deep, slow sound. A dark strip of earth rolled over, revealing fresh, damp soil beneath. The scent of it rose immediately, rich, earthy, and unmistakable. Step by step, the oxen moved forward, and the farmer followed behind. He kept the plow steady, adjusting the angle when needed, leaning into the work with the familiarity of someone who had spent a lifetime in the fields. His boots sank slightly into the soil. His breath settled into a slow rhythm that matched the animal's pace. The fields around him began to brighten. Birds started calling from the hedges. In the distance, other farmers were beginning their mornings, their own oxen creating faint silhouettes against the lightening sky. Each farm operated independently, yet they all depended on one another during the busiest seasons. A good harvest supported not just a single family, but an entire community. As the morning progressed, the farmer paused to sip water from a leather flask. His back ached, but he paid little attention to it. Work in the 1700s always demanded physical endurance. The seasons offered little room for rest, especially during planting and harvest. His children eventually wandered outside. The older ones rubbed sleep from their eyes, while the younger ones clutched small baskets or sticks they imagined were tools. One carried a basket of seeds to help with planting. Another chased a chicken that had slipped away from the coop, laughing softly until their mother called them back to more appropriate tasks. Closer to midday, the farmer stopped for a simple meal. He sat on an overturned bucket near the field's edge. Bread from the previous day, a piece of hard cheese, and an apple formed his lunch. He ate quietly, listening to the faint sounds of insects returning with the day's warmth. Above him, the sky grew clearer. Clouds drifted lazily across the blue. Weather was always on his mind. A single storm could ruin crops, while a prolonged dry spell could endanger his family's entire winter supply. He scanned the horizon, noting the direction of the breeze and the shape of the clouds, forming a mental guess about what the next days would bring. In the afternoon, he returned to the plow. The oxen, though slow, were steady. Together, they created long, straight furrows. Each row represented hope for the season ahead, grain for bread, feed for animals, and small surpluses that could be traded at the village market for tools or necessities they could not produce themselves. Hours passed in this steady rhythm, guiding the plow, encouraging the oxen, and moving through the field one careful row at a time. Farming offered few surprises, but it demanded constant attention. It depended on skill, patience, and the ability to adjust when the weather, soil, or crop behaved differently than expected. By evening, the light softened again. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the fields in muted gold. The farmer brought the oxen back to the barn, removed their harnesses, and brushed dust from their coats. They settled into their stalls with quiet contentment. Returning to the house, he smelled the stew simmering on the hearth. His wife had been preparing it for hours, combining vegetables, herbs, and whatever meat the family had stored. The children gathered around the wooden table. Their dinner was simple but warm, filling the room with a comforting sense of routine. After eating, the farmer stepped outside once more. The fields he had worked all day now glowed faintly in the last light. He watched them for a moment, feeling the familiar tiredness settle into his muscles. It was the kind of fatigue that came from honest works, steady necessary, and never fully finished. As darkness returned, the farm grew quiet. The oxen rested. The chickens perched on their roosts. Inside the house, the family prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring the same tasks, the same rhythm, and the same steady effort. In the 1700s, farming rarely offered glory or recognition, but it provided the stability that every household depended on. Through long days, changing seasons, and endless small tasks, the farmer's work shaped the world around him quietly, consistently, and with a determination that carried from one generation to the next. The baker's early morning bread for the village long before the village stirred, and long before any light reached the rooftops, the baker awakened in the dark. His work demanded that he rise hours earlier than the farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who depended on him. It had been this way since he learned to trade as a young apprentice, and now, many years later, his body woke out of habit even before the faintest hint of dawn. Inside his small cottage, the air was cool. The embers from last night's hearth glowed faintly, offering just enough warmth to take the edge off the early morning chill. The baker sat up slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness. His boots rested by the door, worn down by years of standing on hard floors and walking between home and the bakery. He stood quietly, not wanting to disturb his wife and children, who slept deeply at this hour. With practiced steps, he made his way outside. The village remained silent, except for the occasional rustle of wind. Fog settled low around the cottages, and the air smelled faintly of cooling earth and distant smoke. The bakery stood only a short walk from his door. It was a modest stone building with a heavy wooden door and a squat chimney that rarely went cold. As he pushed the door open, it groaned softly on its hinges. The interior greeted him like an old friend, the familiar scent of flour, the remnants of yesterday's baking, and the lingering warmth trapped within the thick stone walls. His first task was always the same. He crossed the small room to the clay oven, where the fire had nearly died overnight. He knelt and stirred the embers, coaxing them back to life. When a few red sparks appeared, he added pieces of dry wood, careful not to overload the fire. Gradually, the flames grew steady. They illuminated the space in gentle orange light, revealing wooden paddles, sacks of coarse flour, and shelves built to hold the day's loaves. With the fire beginning to warm the oven, the baker moved to the wide wooden trough where the dough would be mixed. He filled a bucket with water drawn from the village, while the night before, poured it into the trough, and added scoops of flour. A small lump of sourdough, starter saved from yesterday's batch, went in next. He sprinkled in salt and rolled up his sleeves. Kneading was a quiet, repetitive process. His hands pressed, folded, and stretched the dough until it transformed from a sticky mixture into a smooth, elastic mass. The steady motion required strength, but it also carried a calm rhythm that the baker knew well. He thought about little during this part of the morning. The work guided his mind as effectively as his hands guided the dough. Once the initial kneading was done, He covered the dough with a cloth to let it rise near the warm oven. The bakery gradually grew warmer as the fire strengthened. Shadows danced along the walls. Outside, faint sounds began to seep into the air. The first rooster crowing, the soft cluck of hens waking, and the distant creak of a shutter opening somewhere in the village. The baker shaped the risen dough into round loaves, each one similar in size, but with its own small imperfections. He placed them onto wooden boards and slid them into the oven with a long-handled peel. The heat inside was intense, and the smell of baking bread began to fill the room almost immediately. He stepped back and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. His workday was still far from over, but the hardest part, the early rise and the firing of the oven, was done. While waiting for the loaves to bake, he swept the flour from the counter and tidied the small bakery. He set aside a few loaves he planned to trade later for eggs or butter, and he checked the condition of his sacks of flour, noting whether he would need more in the coming week. As the sky outside turned gradually lighter, the bakery warmed completely. When the first golden crust slid gently on top of a loaf, he opened the oven door. A wave of hot, fragrant air rolled outward. He pulled the loaves out, one by one, and placed them on racks to cool. The hollow sound of a loaf tapped underneath confirmed that it had baked properly. Soon after sunrise, the first visitor arrived, a farmer already heading to the fields. He stepped into the bakery, brushing cold from his sleeves. Instead of coins, he brought a few eggs, which he offered with a quiet greeting. The baker accepted them with a nod and handed over a warm loaf in exchange. The village still relied heavily on barter. Coins circulated, but not always in abundance. Bread was a valuable commodity, essential to daily meals, and many families traded whatever they had: eggs, fresh milk, cured meat, wool, or a small wedge of cheese. The baker rarely refused these exchanges. Every item helped his own household. A young girl arrived next, clutching a small purse with several coppers inside. She stood on tiptoes to see over the counter as the baker wrapped a loaf in a scrap of cloth for her. Her eyes warmed at the smell of fresh bread in her hands. She thanked him softly before hurrying home. As morning advanced, more villagers visited. The blacksmith's apprentice arrived, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and collected bread for his master. A sailor's wife came for 2 loaves, one for her household, and one she planned to pack for her husband when he returned to the port. An older woman stopped by to trade a bundle of herbs for bread, explaining that she would use the loaf to make a simple meal that evening. Throughout the village, the scent of fresh bread drifted through open doors and windows. Children passed by the bakery with crusts in their hands, and the sound of early conversation filled the square. By mid-morning, the busiest hours had passed. Most of the bread had been sold or traded, leaving only a few loaves cooling on the shelves. The baker finally allowed himself a moment to rest. He leaned against the counter, stretching his back. Though his workday had begun in darkness, it was still far from over. The bakery needed sweeping, the oven needed cleaning, and preparations for the next day's dough had to begin before evening. He stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The sun had risen fully by now, warming the village and brightening the stone walls of nearby buildings. He watched a group of children chasing each other across the square. He noticed the farmer walking back toward his fields. He saw the blacksmith reopen his forge, sparks beginning to fly as metal touched metal. These were familiar scenes, unchanged from day to day. The baker found comfort in their predictability. His contributional warm loaf in the hands of nearly every family was small but essential. Bread sustained the village just as surely as the fields and the forge did. Later in the afternoon, he carried the basket of eggs he had received earlier back to his home. His wife could make use of them immediately, perhaps, in a stew or a custard if enough had been saved. His own children would be awake and eager to see what he had brought back. As evening approached, the bakery cooled again. The last crumbs were swept into a small bin. The wooden paddles and mixing bowls were hung neatly in their places. The oven dimmed, its fire reduced to a comfortable glow. The baker closed up the shop and walked home through the quieting village. Families were eating supper. Smoke drifted from chimneys, and the day slowly surrendered to dusk. Tomorrow would arrive early again, long before the first rooster crowed. But tonight, the baker rested, satisfied that his work had once again helped the village begin its day. The blacksmith's forge, heat, iron, and daily work. As the morning light strengthened across the village, another workshop began its daily routine. The blacksmith's forge, located near the edge of the square, had already been warming for some time. The blacksmith was not the earliest riser in the community. That honor belonged to the baker and the farmers, but his work required a different kind of preparation. Even before he lifted his hammer, the fire had to reach the right heat. The blacksmith was a broad-shouldered man in his middle years, with hands marked by burns, calluses, and decades of handling hot metal. His leather apron, darkened from smoke and sparks, hung heavily from his shoulders. Although his craft demanded physical strength, much of his day relied on precision and patience rather than brute force. He opened the workshop door to let in a bit of the cool morning air. Smoke and the faint scent of iron drifted out through the open space. Inside, the forge glowed a deep red, and the faint roar of steadily rising flames filled the room. The blacksmith checked its intensity, adjusting the bellows so that the fire reached a consistent temperature. His apprentice, a boy of about 12, arrived shortly after. The boy greeted him quietly, still unsure of himself, but eager to learn. His clothing was simple, but already stained with soot, despite the short time he had worked here. Apprenticeship was never easy, especially in trades involving heat, tools, and long hours. But he had chosen this path with his parents' blessing. The blacksmith handed him a pair of tongs and nodded toward the bellows. Without needing further instruction, the boy moved to them and began working the mechanism. The steady push and pull sent a stream of air into the forge, making the coals flare brighter. The workshop warmed rapidly, and the air filled with the familiar metallic scent of heated iron. The first task of the day involved shaping a set of horseshoes. The local farmer had requested them the night before, knowing his horse would soon need new shoes for the heavy work ahead. The blacksmith selected a bar of iron from the wall, gripped it with tongs, and placed it deep into the heart of the fire. He waited until the iron glowed a bright orange. Once it reached the correct temperature, he carried it to the anvil. The hammer in his hand fell with a rhythmic sound, solid, ringing, and steady. Each strike flattened the iron gradually, shaping it into a curve. The apprentice watched closely, his eyes following the blacksmith's movements with careful attention. The ringing of the hammer carried through the village. For many villagers, it was a comforting sound, marking the start of daily activity. Even children recognized the familiar rhythm. Some would pause outside the shop to peek in, hoping to catch a glimpse of sparks flying into the air. Inside, the blacksmith and his apprentice worked in silence, communicating mostly through gestures and small nods. The apprentice handed tools as needed: a shaping hammer, tongs of different sizes, and a bucket of water for quenching. Each task had its own technique, and the boy was just beginning to learn them. When the shaping of the horseshoe was complete, the blacksmith plunged the metal into the water trough. Steam rose immediately, filling the air with a sharp hiss. After checking its form and smoothing its edges, he set it aside to cool and began shaping the next one. Work in the forge was not limited to horseshoes. Throughout the day, villagers visited with various needs. A woman arrived carrying a broken hinge from her cottage door. The hinge had snapped during a storm the previous week. The blacksmith examined it, noting the crack along the thinnest part. He heated it carefully, reshaped the metal, and reinforced it before handing it back to her. She thanked him and left with the hinge wrapped in a piece of cloth for protection. Later, a kupa from a nearby village came with a wagon wheel's iron rim. It needed to be refitted after the wood had expanded slightly. The blacksmith measured it, reheated the metal, and reshaped it so the wheelwright could secure it back onto the wooden frame. Tasks varied throughout the day, and each one required different tools. Hammers of multiple weights lined the wall. Anvils of various sizes sat in corners, worn from years of use. Files, chisels, tongs, and punches hung neatly from wooden pegs. The workshop was organized in a way that ensured the blacksmith always knew where each tool was located. By late morning, the temperature inside the forge climbed significantly. Sweat lined the blacksmith's forehead, and the apprentice's face reddened from the heat. Still, they continued with the routine. The blacksmith paused occasionally to stretch his arms or take a drink of cool water. His movements were steady, not rushed, and not sluggish. Years of experience had taught him the pace needed to endure long days beside the fire. A few villagers stopped by simply to talk for a moment or ask when a tool would be repaired. The forge served as a small gathering place at times. People trusted the blacksmith's opinion, and he, in turn, listened to their needs or worries. His knowledge of tools, weather, and the condition of local equipment made him an important member of the community. Around midday, work slowed just enough for a brief break. The blacksmith and apprentice stepped outside to eat. Their lunch was simple: bread, cheese, and a small jug of beer or water. They ate in the shade behind the workshop, letting the cooler air ease the heat of the forge from their skin. After the break, the blacksmith returned to another task, a plowshare that needed to be The farmer waited nearby, leaning against the workshop door. The blacksmith reheated the metal, adjusted its angle, and hammered it into shape. The farmer watched with appreciation, knowing that a well-made tool could mean the difference between a successful harvest and a difficult season. Throughout the afternoon, the apprentice continued to practice basic skills. Under the blacksmith's supervision, he heated small pieces of metal, hammered them into simple shapes, and learned how to recognize when the metal was too hot or too cool. Each task built a foundation for more advanced work later in his training. As the light outside softened again toward evening, the forge finally began to quiet. The blacksmith examined the tools for the next day, organizing them on hooks and shelves. The apprentice swept the floor, pushing bits of ash, metal scraps, and coal dust into a small pile. The blacksmith doused the fire gradually, allowing it to cool at a safe pace. The glow of the coals dimmed, casting long shadows across the workshop. Soon the space would rest until the next morning. With the fire finally settling into embers, the blacksmith removed his apron. His clothes were marked by soot, and his arms felt the strain of the day's work. Still, he was satisfied. The horseshoes were ready, tools were repaired, and the villagers who visited had left with what they needed. He stepped outside into the evening air, which felt cool after a full day near the forge. The village around him was winding down. Children headed inside, farmers returned from the fields, and windows began glowing with the soft light of candles. The blacksmith locked the workshop door and walked toward his home. Tomorrow would bring another set of tasks: more tools, more repairs, more shaping of iron into the objects that kept daily life running smoothly. But for now, he welcomed the quiet of evening and the chance to rest before another day by the forge. Threads of life, the weaver and her loom in a modest cottage on the quieter side of the village. The weaver began her day with a rising light. She was not required to wake before dawn like the farmer or the baker. Yet the habit of early rising had shaped her routine over many years. Her work was steady and time-consuming, and mornings offered long stretches of peaceful hours in which she could make progress. The cottage where she lived and worked smelled faintly of wool, lanolin, and the dried herbs she kept hanging from the rafters. Its single main room held most of what she needed: simple furniture, a hearth for cooking, baskets filled with raw wool. The loom stood as both a tool and a presence in the room. Its wooden frame was smooth from years of use, and the threads stretched across it were arranged neatly in rows of muted color. Her hands moved with practiced familiarity, ensuring nothing had shifted or tangled. Weaving demanded patience and order. Even the smallest mistake could ripple across the entire cloth. Before she began weaving, she worked at her spinning wheel. A basket beside a chair held tufts of wool she had washed and carded earlier in the week. She took a handful, pulled it gently to create an even strand, and began spinning. The wheel turned with a smooth, steady rhythm. As it spun, loose fibers twisted into thread, gathering onto the spindle with each rotation. The wheel's soft hum filled the cottage. It was a repetitive sound, calming and predictable, much like the work itself. Spinning required concentration, but not constant thought, allowing her mind to drift through memories, plans, or small concerns about weather in the coming seasons. She occasionally paused to check the thickness of the thread. Too thick, and it would weave unevenly. Too thin, and it might snap under tension. She adjusted her motion, slightly pulling more gently or feeding the wool at a different rate until the thread met her standards. When she had spun enough for the morning's work, she wound the thread into skeins and moved back to the loom. Sitting on the small bench, she positioned herself carefully. Her feet rested on the treadles below, and her hands took hold of the shuttle. The loom awaited her attention, the warp stretched tight across the frame. She pressed a treadle, and the thread separated into two layers, creating a gap known as the shed. With a clean, practiced movement, She passed the shuttle through the gap, letting the weft thread slide across. She then pulled the beater toward her, pressing the new row of thread firmly into place. The action was familiar. Treadle, shuttle, beat. The pattern repeated again and again. The loom responded with a soft wooden thump each time she beat the thread into position. It was the sound of works, controlled and continuous. As she wove, the cloth slowly grew beneath her hands. Today she was working on a length of woolen fabric, ordered by a family expecting a newborn in a few months. They planned to use the cloth for blankets and swaddling. The weaver took extra care with pieces meant for infants, ensuring the weave was tight and even, with no loose ends that might irritate delicate skin. The colors she used were subtle soft browns, muted grays, and a faint blue she had dyed using woad from her small garden. Bright dyes were costly and often required ingredients that were difficult to obtain. Most villagers preferred sturdy, practical cloth that could withstand daily use, and the weaver's work reflected that practicality. Throughout the morning, she paused occasionally to stretch her hands and back. Weaving required long hours in the same position, and she had learned over the years to take breaks often enough to avoid injury. During these pauses, she sometimes stepped outside to breathe fresh air. The village around her was now fully awake. Children ran past with sticks and stones. A dog barked half-heartedly at a group of chickens wandering too close to its resting place, and the blacksmith's hammer rang in the distance. She returned to her seat at the loom and resumed her work. The cloth continued to grow. The repetitive motion allowed for little distraction, and she found comfort in the predictability of the task. Every inch woven was progress slow but steady, inch by inch, hour by hour. Midday approached, and she set aside her tools long enough to prepare a simple meal. The stew simmering in the pot over the hearth had been cooking since morning. She added a handful of herbs and stirred it slowly. After eating, she cleaned the small dish and returned to her loom. By early afternoon, a visitor arrived, neighbor carrying a small bundle of wool. The woman apologized for interrupting, but asked if the weaver could take on another commission, this time for a length of coarse cloth suitable for winter cloaks. The weaver accepted the wool, examined its quality, and estimated how long the work would take. They agreed on a fair exchange, some cloth for the wool provided, and a small portion of vegetables from the neighbor's garden. The weaver placed the wool with her other supplies. She would wash, card, and spin it in the coming days. But for now, she returned to the loom to finish the morning's piece. Later in the afternoon, she approached the final length of the cloth she had been weaving. She slowed her pace slightly, ensuring the edges remained even. Once she completed the final row, she carefully loosened the tension on the warp threads and removed the finished fabric from the loom. She held it up to inspect to check in for consistent weaving, secure edges, and appropriate length. Satisfied, she folded the cloth neatly and placed it in a wooden chest where finished orders were kept until pickup. With the major task of the day complete, she turned her attention to preparations for the next project. She sorted dyed threads, trimmed loose ends from previously woven pieces, and organized her tools. Spinning, weaving, and preparing fibers created small piles of scraps and stray threads, and she gathered them into a basket to be reused when possible. Nothing was wasted if it could be repurposed. Toward evening, the light in the cottage softened. The weaver lit a small oil lamp near the window. She preferred the last quiet hours of the day for simple tasks, repairing torn garments, patching worn sleeves, or spinning a small amount of thread for the next week. Work as a weaver required consistency rather than speed. A single piece of cloth could take days or weeks, depending on its size and complexity, yet every completed piece served an important purpose. Clothing for a family, sacks for storing grain, blankets for newborns, or heavy fabric for winter cloaks. Before night settled fully, she tidied her tools once more. The loom stood silent in the dim light. The spinning wheel rested by the hearth. The cottage around her was quiet, warm, and orderly. She extinguished the lamp and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow, she would continue her work spinning, weaving, and shaping the threads that supported the daily life of the village. Her craft, though quiet and often unnoticed, helped clothe her neighbors and brought routine comfort to her small corner of the world. Life at sea. Sailors and the merchant waters in the early 1700s. Life on the sea shaped entire communities. While farmers tended fields and craftsmen worked in their shops, sailors followed a different rhythm, guided by tides, winds, and the slow pull of distant horizons. In a small coastal town not far from the village, a modest merchant ship prepared for another journey across familiar trade routes. Its crew, though small in number, carried the knowledge and experience needed to navigate unpredictable waters. The ship bobbed gently in the harbor at dawn. Its wooden hull creaked softly with each shift of the tide. Gulls circled overhead, their calls echoing between the docks and the shoreline. The sound of ropes brushing against worn wooden posts blended with distant conversations from fishermen returning from their early catch. The ship's captain stood on deck, checking the rigging with a careful eye. He was a man in his late 40s, weathered by years of wind and salt. His hands bore the marks of countless voyages, and his face carried the calm expression of someone accustomed to long stretches away from land. Although he held authority aboard the vessel, his demeanor remained steady and measured. Experience had taught him that calmness served a crew better than loud commands. Nearby, several sailors loaded crates onto the ship. The cargo included sacks of grain, coils of rope, pottery wrapped in straw, and bundles of wool goods. The town planned to trade at a port several days away. Each crate was checked, lifted carefully, and arranged in the ship's hold. The sailors moved with familiarity, their motions shaped by practice rather than haste. One sailor, a young man in his early 20s, hauled a sack over his shoulder and carried it across the deck. He had joined the crew only a year ago, but he had already learned the basics of life at sea. His hands were stronger now, and his balance had improved after months of adjusting to the ship's motion underfoot. The older sailors watched over him, offering guidance when needed, but allowing him to grow into the work through repetition. Before the ship departed, the crew assembled on deck for a final review. The captain checked the weather, noting the direction of the breeze and the formation of clouds on the horizon. He discussed the expected route, potential hazards, and the duties each sailor would manage during the journey. The tone was practical and calm. Everyone understood their role. By mid-morning, the tide was favorable. The anchor was raised with steady work from several sets of hands. The sailors moved methodically, pulling ropes, securing lines, and adjusting sails. As the ship drifted away from the dock, the familiar land slowly retreated behind them. The coastal town, with its small houses and wooden boats, grew smaller and smaller until it blended with the shoreline. Once the harbor faded from view, the ship settled into its sailing rhythm. The sails caught the wind, filling slowly, and the vessel moved across the water with a gentle forward motion. The ocean stretched before them, calm and open under the broad daylight. The waves rolled in, even cycles, nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just the steady movement characteristic of fair weather. Life aboard the ship followed a structured routine. The captain oversaw navigation, using charts, a compass, and his understanding of currents. An older sailor, experienced with knots and rigging, maintained the sails and inspected the ropes for wear. The youngest sailor assisted wherever needed, screwing the deck, tying lines, or carrying supplies. Each member of the crew had a place in the system, and their coordinated efforts kept the ship functioning smoothly. Meals aboard were simple. In the small galley near the center of the ship, a pot of stew simmered over a fire secured within a metal frame. The cook, a quiet man with a practical manner, distributed wooden bowls to the crew. They gathered on deck, sitting near the railings or leaning against the mast, eating while watching the waves shift beneath the ship. Afternoons passed in a calm sequence of duties. The captain checked their course frequently. Sailors mended torn fabric or repaired small cracks in wooden crates. Some polished tools, ensuring everything remained ready for unexpected weather. The younger sailor examined knots under the guidance of the older crew members, practicing until his hands moved confidently. Occasionally, the crew spotted dolphins swimming near the ship or a distant flock of seabirds diving for fish. Such sights brought brief moments of interest during long stretches of open water, but the sailors reacted to them with calm appreciation rather than excitement. These were familiar parts of their world. As evening approached, the sky turned softer in color, shifting from bright blue to muted gold. The ship continued moving at a steady pace. The waves grew slightly darker, reflecting the fading light. The crew prepared for the night by adjusting the sails and securing loose items on deck. The captain reviewed the forecast one last time, satisfied that calm conditions would continue. Night aboard a merchant ship was quieter than many imagined. There were no lanterns blazing across the deck, only a few small lamps placed safely near the mast or in the galley. The dim light minimized the risk of fire, a constant concern on wooden vessels. The sailors spoke softly, their voices blending with the rhythmic sound of waves brushing the hull. The crew divided into shifts. Some rested immediately, stretching out on simple mats or leaning against barrels in sheltered corners of the deck. Others remained awake to maintain watch, an essential part of protecting the ship. They scanned the dark horizon for signs of approaching weather, other vessels, or unusual disturbances in the water. The younger sailor took the second watch, learning to observe the sea with patience. Above them, the stars appeared in full clarity, brighter than the lamps below. The open sky over the ocean offered a view rarely seen from land. The constellations guided the captain, who often stood on deck late into the night, using their positions to confirm the ship's direction. The ship moved gently through the water, maintaining its slow, steady course. The creak of wooden planks and the flap of half-filled sails formed the backdrop to the quiet night. No loud footsteps, no hurried activity, just the rhythms shaped by wind and water. By the next morning, the crew woke gradually. The sailors stretched their limbs, rinsed their faces with seawater, and returned to their duties. Another day of work awaited them, similar to the one before, yet still essential to their livelihood. The ocean continued its unbroken motion, carrying them toward the distant port where they would deliver their cargo. Life at sea was demanding, but it offered a sense of routine and purpose. The sailors understood the risks and the challenges, unpredictable currents, and long periods away from home, but they accepted them as part of their trade. The work provided income, connection to far-off places, and the respect of their families and communities. As the ship continued its journey, the crew settled back into their tasks. The captain adjusted the sails to make better use of the morning wind. The older sailor tightened a rigging line that had loosened overnight. The sea stretched ahead, column open, guiding the crew toward the next destination. For them, the ocean was both workplace and pathway, a vast, shifting road shaped by currents, weather, and patience. The seasons that ruled all work in the early 1700s. The rhythm of life for ordinary people was set not by clocks or calendars, but by the quiet authority of the seasons. Every family, every craft, and nearly every livelihood in the village depended on nature's cycle. People did not simply live through the seasons. They worked within them, adjusting their routines as the year turned from cold to warm, and from planting time to harvest. The farmers, tradesmen, and craftsmen all understood these changes instinctively. The seasons defined when fields were plowed, when cloth was dyed, when ships set sail, and when families gathered to mend tools for the year ahead. No one could ignore the sky, the temperature, the soil, or the wind. Each season brought its own responsibilities, its own challenges, and its own quieter moments of rest. Spring. This season of beginning. Spring arrived slowly, and the villagers watched for signs that winter was finally losing its grip. The earliest hints of green appeared along the edges of fields. Streams, frozen only weeks before, began running again. Birds returned to the trees, their calls marking the change before the weather did. For the farmer, spring meant preparation. The soil had to be turned, rocks removed from fields, and seeds planted before the weather grew too warm. Each morning he checked the ground to see if it had dried enough for plowing. Once he judged it ready, he guided the oxen across the fields with steady determination, forming row after row of furrows. Other villagers, though not farmers, still felt spring's demands. The weaver washed wool more frequently, letting it dry in the warming air. The blacksmith repaired plowshares and sharpened tools for the entire village. The baker used more flour as families worked longer hours and needed hearty meals. Spring was a time of planning and hope. The work was steady but encouraging. It marked the start of a new cycle, one that everyone depended upon. Summer, the season of growth. By the time summer arrived, the village had settled into its busiest stretch. The days were long, and the sun rose early. Farmers spent extended hours in the fields, tending the crops that had begun to sprout. Weeding, watering, and protecting young plants from pests took much of their time. Children helped outdoors when they could. They gathered fallen branches for firewood, carried buckets of water, or helped herd livestock to better grazing areas. Their work was lighter than that of adults, but still important. In the village workshops, summer brought its own pace. The blacksmith's forge grew especially hot. He took care to drink water throughout the day and paused between heavy tasks to stand briefly in the shade. The weaver took advantage of the bright sunshine to dry-dyed threads outside, laying them neatly across wooden racks. Colors set deeper in the strong sun, and she often planned her dyeing around the weather. Fishermen along the coast left before sunrise to take advantage of calmer morning waters. The sailors prepared ships for longer journeys, knowing summer offered the best conditions for travel. Summer food preparation also demanded effort. Gardens produced vegetables that needed to be harvested before they spoiled. Families dried herbs, stored roots, and began preparing for the colder months. Even though winter felt far away, summer's work rarely paused, but the long daylight hours helped the villagers complete what needed to be done. Autumn, the season of harvest. Autumn carried a different energy. It was a season of urgency, not rushed, but focused. The fields changed color from green to gold as crops ripened. Farmers moved quickly to gather grain before unexpected storms arrived. Entire households worked together. Parents cut stalks, older children tied them into bundles, and younger children collected stray pieces left behind. The miller, in a nearby town, became one of the busiest workers of the season. Farmers carried sacks of grain to be ground into flour, forming lines that often stretched through the morning. Grain was heavy, and transportation took effort, but producing flour for winter was essential. The baker felt autumn's influence as well. Families brought extra flour to him, asking for larger orders of bread or special loaves for seasonal gatherings. His ovens burned longer each day as he worked through these requests. The weavers sometimes received more wool during autumn. Sheep were sheared earlier in the year, but some families waited until cooler weather to bring the wool to her. For spinning and weaving, she prepared thicker cloth for winter coats and blankets, aware that the coming cold required sturdier materials. Autumn evenings brought a special kind of quiet. After long days in the fields and workshops, the villagers returned home tired but satisfied. Harvest season was demanding, but it also offered a visible reward for months of work. Granaries filled, pantries grew crowded. The sense of preparation created comfort as temperatures dropped each week. Winter, the season of rest and repair, winter changed the pace of life more than any other season. Snow sometimes drifted across the fields, covering them in quiet layers that made work impossible. The days were short, fires were kept burning continuously, and most tasks moved indoors. For the farmer, winter offered time to repair tools, mend fences, and prepare the farm for spring. He checked grain stores regularly, making sure mice or moisture had not spoiled anything. Livestock required attention. Feed had to be rationed carefully, and water often needed breaking through morning ice. Inside the cottage, the weaver worked steadily. Winter was one of her most productive seasons, with less outdoor work for most families. People turned their attention to clothing repairs, new blankets, and household needs. Her loom clicked quietly through long, cold evenings. The blacksmith also remained active, though his tasks changed. Instead of making tools for field work, he repaired household items, fixed hinges stiffened by the cold, and sharpened knives used frequently during winter cooking. The baker maintained his usual routine, though winter mornings were colder and the walk to the well required extra effort when ice formed. His warm bakery became a gathering place on some mornings, a welcome change from the chill outside. Winter created a slower rhythm. Families spent more time indoors, sitting by the fire while sharing stories or working on small crafts. Sailors stayed closer to shore, avoiding the unpredictable storms that winter winds often carried. Though winter seemed quiet, it served an important purpose. It allowed rest, reflection, and preparation before the cycle began again. The cycle that defined life through all these seasons. The village followed a dependable pattern. No one needed a written calendar to know what time of year it was. The land, the sky, and their daily work told them everything they needed to know. Spring brought renewal. Summer demanded effort. Autumn rewarded labor. Winter offered rest. Each season was essential. Together, They formed the structure that shaped every life in the village. People understood the importance of patience, timing, and preparation, not because someone taught them, but because nature required it. As another year unfolded, the villagers continued their steady routines, guided always by the seasons that governed the rhythm of their work and the pace of their lives. Apprentices and master craftsmen in the 1700s, skilled trades shaped the quiet foundation of village life. While farmers worked the fields and merchants traveled between ports, the craftsmen ensured that homes, tools, clothing, and essential goods remained functional. Their knowledge was built slowly over many years, often beginning in childhood under a system that had existed for generations: apprenticeship. Becoming an apprentice was one of the most important turning points in a young person's life. Around the age of 12, a boy or girl might be placed under the guidance of a master craftsman. The decision was usually made by the family, who considered the child's interests, abilities, and the opportunities available in the community. Some children showed a natural gift for working with wood, while others demonstrated careful hands perfect for sewing or weaving. Families tried to match the child with a profession that suited them. When an agreement was reached, the apprentice moved into the master's household or began spending long hours in his workshop. Living arrangements varied from family to family, but the apprentice always became part of the daily routine. The master provided food, clothing, and training. In return, the apprentice offered loyalty, hard work, and patience. The early days of apprenticeship were filled with observation. A new apprentice did not begin by using tools or creating complex items. Instead, they watched the master's experienced hands, memorizing movements and paying attention to how materials were handled. They swept the workshop floors, fetched water, collected firewood, and organized tools. These tasks may have seemed simple, but they taught discipline and responsibility. In a carpenter's workshop, for example, the apprentice learned how to store wood so it would not warp in the damp air. They sorted nails, sharpened tools under supervision, and observed how boards were measured and cut. Only after months of basic tasks did the master allow them to try small projects: shaping a wooden peg, smoothing a plank, or carving a simple joint. In the blacksmith's forge, apprentices worked near heat and sparks. Before touching the forge themselves, they assisted by pumping the bellows to maintain the fire's temperature, carrying tools to the master, or cooling metal in the water trough. After enough time, the apprentice was allowed to heat and hammer small pieces of iron under careful guidance. Even mistakes taught important lessons, and each spark, each swing of the hammer, became part of their growing skill. Weavers also trained apprentices, though often in quieter workshops. A young apprentice learned how to wash wool, card fibers, prepare dyes, and spin threads before ever touching the loom. Once they demonstrated consistency in these early tasks, the master allowed them to weave small, simple pieces. Over the years, they learned patterns, tension, control, and the delicate balance required to create even, sturdy cloth. Shoemakers, coopers, wheelwrights, and tailors followed similar systems. Each trade had its rhythm and style, but the structure of apprenticeship remained largely the same. Years of slow, steady practice shaped the apprentice into someone who could eventually take on more complex tasks. The system worked because it preserved knowledge through generations. Master craftsmen took pride in their work, and that pride extended to teaching the next generation. They did not rush the process. They introduced each skill when the apprentice was ready, not simply when the apprentice asked. As apprentices grew older, usually in their mid-teens, they gained more responsibility. The master expected them to complete parts of larger projects or take on routine work independently. At these stages, the apprentice understood most tools and methods, though they still consulted the master when challenges arose. Many apprentices lived closely with the master's family, sharing meals and chores. They became familiar figures in the household. Masters enforced discipline when needed, but they also provided guidance, advice, and support. The relationship was often respectful, and in many cases, apprentices later spoke fondly of their training years. Journeymen represented the next stage. After several years of apprenticeship, usually around the age of 18 or 20, the apprentice completed their basic training and became a journeyman suwan. Skilled enough to work for wages but not yet established as a master, journeymen often traveled from one village to another, seeking work and learning new techniques. This mobility helps spread ideas and skills between communities. A journeyman's life involves steady work, but also a sense of independence. They were no longer under the direct authority of a single master, though they frequently carried letters of recommendation to prove their training. They worked in various shops, assisting craftsmen and improving their abilities. Some journeymen stayed close to their home village, while others ventured far to learn regional methods or work in larger towns where more opportunities existed. Becoming a master craftsman required producing a masterpiece, a single piece of work demonstrating the highest skill of the trade. The guilds or local craft authorities reviewed this piece. If it met the standards, the journeymen received approval to open their own workshop, hire apprentices, and contribute fully to the skilled community. Guilds played a quiet but important role in all of this. Though they varied from region to region, guilds typically set rules for training, ensured fair pricing for goods, and upheld quality standards. Guild members met to discuss trade matters, support craftsmen in times of illness or hardship, and help maintain a sense of order. While the guild structure was strongest in towns and cities, its influence often reached surrounding villages as well. Fairness and honesty were emphasized. A master who cheated customers or mistreated apprentices risked damaged reputation or penalties from the guild. Most craftsmen valued their standing too much to take such risks. Their reputation determined how many commissions they received and how much trust their neighbors placed in them. The apprentice system shaped not only trades, but also community bonds. Families took pride when a child advanced through the stages. Craftsmen relied on one another for materials, advice, and help with complex projects. The rhythm of the village reflected these relationships. When the blacksmith needed wood for handles, he turned to the carpenter. When the carpenter's tools dulled, he visited the blacksmith. The weaver depended on the farmers for wool, and the farmers depended on the weaver to create sturdy cloth for their households. Most importantly, the apprentice system ensured that skills never disappeared. Even if a master grew old or a journeyman moved away, the knowledge continued through those who had learned it. Every completed tool, woven cloth, or repaired wheel represented years of accumulated practice and shared learning. As evening settled across the village, apprentices in various workshops finished their tasks for the day. They swept floors, cleaned tools, and listened to final instructions before returning home or settling into the master's household for the night. Their workday had been long, filled with routine tasks and moments of patience, but each day moved them closer to becoming skilled craftsmen themselves. As they slipped, the workshops rested silent spaces, waiting for another day of steady learning and practice. The system that guided their growth had shaped generations before them and would continue shaping future generations, preserving the quiet craftsmanship that sustained village life. Guilds, the quiet guardians of trades in the early 1700s. Behind every skilled craft and well-made tool, there existed a quiet structure that kept the trades organized and protected. The guilds. These groups were not loud or imposing, nor were they filled with political power. Instead, they acted as steady guardians of quality, fairness, and learning. Their influence reached towns, villages, and rural workshops, shaping the everyday life of craftsmen in ways that were subtle but deeply important. Guilds did not have large buildings in most small villages. Instead, their presence was felt through the rules, traditions, and expectations that guided the work of carpenters, blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, and others. In larger towns, guild halls stood proudly at the center of the community. These halls served as meeting places for members and as symbols of stability within a changing world. Membership within a guild began with training. Apprentices, under the supervision of a master, slowly learned the trade. Journeymen traveled, improving their skills and earning wages. To become a master craftsman, one had to present a masterpiece, a carefully crafted item that demonstrated skill, precision, and understanding of the trade. The guild examined this piece and judged whether the craftsman was ready to be recognized as a master. This system ensured that every village and town maintained high standards. Customers could trust that a pair of shoes, a barrow, or a plow had been made by someone properly trained. It also prevented unfair competition. Craftsmen could not simply claim mastery, they had to prove it. In the village connected to our story, most craftsmen belonged to guilds, headquartered in the nearest town. The blacksmith traveled there once a month for meetings, returning with news, shared techniques, or small changes in pricing rules. The carpenter and wheelwright sometimes joined him, walking along the road at dawn and returning before nightfall. These meetings were not dramatic affairs. They were simple gatherings held in long rooms with wooden benches and tall windows. Guild elders reviewed accounts, recorded new apprenticeships, and settled disputes. If a craftsman had been accused of using inferior materials or charging dishonest prices, the guild investigated the matter calmly. Guilds valued reputation. A craftsman without integrity could lose customers quickly, and the guild's judgment held weight. However, punishment was rare. Most craftsmen respected their work and wanted to maintain the trust of their community. For many craftsmen, belonging to a guild offered a sense of security. If sickness struck and a man could not work for several weeks, the guild often offered financial help. If a workshop burned down due to an accident, guild members contributed materials or funds to help rebuild it. This support was not lavish, but it prevented families from falling into hardship. Guilds also played a role in setting prices. Not in a strict or controlling way, but in a manner that ensured fairness. They discussed the cost of materials: Zion wood, wool, grain, and recommended appropriate prices for finished goods. These guidelines prevented undercutting, which could harm smaller workshops. They also protected customers from being charged unreasonable amounts. In the village, these guidelines were followed closely. The baker, for example, knew how much to charge for a loaf of bread based on the cost of flour, firewood, and labor. The guild offered general guidance, and he used it to manage his daily production. If the price of grain began to rise due to a poor harvest, the guild informed members, and bakers adjusted their prices carefully to maintain fairness. Guilds supported quality in more subtle ways as well. They encouraged masters to teach apprentices properly, ensuring that the skills of each trade passed smoothly from one generation to the next. A poorly trained apprentice became a poorly equipped journeyman, and ultimately a weak master. The guild structure prevented this by maintaining standards and encouraging craftsmen to take pride in their work. In Summertown's guilds organized small festivals or gatherings. These were modest events where craftsmen displayed their work, shared new techniques, and celebrated the completion of apprenticeships. Families attended, children admired the polished tools and colorful fabrics, and the atmosphere was one of shared accomplishments. Though the village in our story rarely held such events, the influence reached them. News of a successful apprenticeship or a particularly well-made masterpiece often traveled between communities. Guilds also helped settle disagreements. If two craftsmen argued over the price of materials, ownership of a tool, or a damaged piece of work, they brought the matter before the guild. The elders listened carefully, asked questions, and then offered a fair resolution. Their decisions focused on maintaining peace and trust within the trade. Even outside of official meetings, guild members supported one another. A blacksmith might loan iron to a carpenter who needed it unexpectedly. A weaver might share dye with another craftsman who had run short. These exchanges were not recorded formally, but they reflected the spirit of cooperation encouraged by the guilds. Journeymen benefited from guild connections as well. A journeyman traveling to a distant town for work could present a letter from the guild, proving his training and skill. This made it easier for him to find employment, shelter, or assistance. Guild networks extended across regions, providing structure and opportunities that would otherwise have been difficult for young craftsmen to access. Although guilds focused on practical matters, they also represented a sense of identity. Members took pride in belonging to a centuries-old tradition. Tools were not merely items of work, they were symbols of a shared craft. Masters often passed down their tools to apprentices who showed promise, continuing a lineage of skills, care, and quiet dedication. In the village, craftsmen sometimes gathered informally to discuss trade matters, even when no official meeting was scheduled. The carpenter and blacksmith might stand outside the forge at the end of the day, talking about tool orders or new methods learned in town. The weaver occasionally joined, sharing updates on dye supplies or patterns requested by customers. The influence of guilds could be felt in daily life, even when no one mentioned them directly. The regularity of prices, the quality of goods, the training of apprentices, and the steady trust between craftsmen all stemmed from the quiet structure the guilds provided. As evening settled on the village, workshops grew quiet. Tools hung neatly on walls, fabrics rested on looms, and the smell of smoke softened the air. Craftsmen returned home, confident that their work was supported by a system older than themselves, a system created to protect, guide, and preserve the skills that shaped their community. Guilds were never loud, but they were steady. Their rules, discussions, and traditions helped maintain balance. In a world shaped by manual labor and close communities, the guilds served as guardians of knowledge, ensuring that each craft and each craftsman had the support needed to carry their trade into the future. Market day, gathering, barter, and community life. Market day arrived only once a week in the village, but its influence lingered through nearly every household and workshop. It was not a noisy or chaotic event like the grand markets of large cities. Instead, it was steady, familiar, and quietly essential. People prepared for it throughout the week, setting aside goods, planning exchanges, and adjusting their work to ensure they had something ready to bring. As dawn approached on market day, the village square began to change. The stone well in the center, usually surrounded by silence, became a place of early movement. Farmers arrived first, their carts creaking under the weight of vegetables, sacks of grain, or baskets of eggs. One farmer carried bundles of herbs tied with twine. Another brought apples stored carefully from autumn. They lifted their goods from the cart and arranged them neatly on wooden tables or directly on clean cloths spread over the ground. A few minutes later, the blacksmith walked across the square with repaired tools wrapped in cloth. He placed them on a small bench near the edge of the market space. Next came the carpenter, carrying wooden bowls, simply cheers, and carved utensils. He arranged his items so villagers could see the shape and grain of each piece. The baker arrived carrying 2 large baskets of bread, one filled with round loaves and the other with smaller rolls. The warm scent drifted across the square, drawing attention even before the loaves were visible. The baker placed the baskets beneath a small canopy to keep the bread shaded as the morning progressed. The weaver was quieter in her arrival. She brought folded cloth, bundles of dyed thread, and a few finished garments. She placed them carefully on a table that her neighbor had set up earlier. Her goods attracted people who preferred sturdy fabrics that lasted through several winters. Not all villagers sold goods. Some came to trade, others to observe, and many simply to talk with their neighbors. Market day provided a rhythm to the week, a small break from daily routines, a chance to connect with others, and a reminder that the village functioned best when people supported one another. As the sun climbed, the square filled gradually. A fisherman from the nearby coast arrived, his cart carrying small barrels of salted fish. He had traveled since early morning, timing his journey to arrive before the bread and vegetables were sold. His presence always added something different to the market, a reminder of the sea beyond the fields. Children moved eagerly between tables, not yet burdened by the needs of trade or household decisions. Some carried baskets for their families. Others simply whispered excitedly about the items on display. A few lingered near the baker, hoping to receive a scrap of bread if the baker found them familiar. Bartering was common. A villager might offer a handful of apples in exchange for a small bag of flour. Another traded a length of cloth for a wooden bowl or a repaired hinge. Coins were used, but not always. Many families relied more on what they could offer from home: vegetables, wool, or small handmade items. The blacksmith received a pair of eggs in exchange for sharpening a knife. The weaver accepted dried herbs for a small spool of thread. The baker traded 2 loaves for a basket of potatoes. Each exchange carried practicality, trust, and mutual understanding. No one tried to take advantage of another. The market thrived because everyone respected the value of each person's work. From time to time, travelers from neighboring villages passed through. They brought goods not available locally, such as pottery with different patterns, honey from hives located farther into the forest, or fabrics dyed in colors the village rarely saw. Villagers greeted them with interest, but still approached the exchanges with calm deliberation. Curiosity existed, but the market never slipped into loud excitement. A gentle hum of conversation filled the square. People discussed weather forecasts, the progress of crops, and upcoming church gatherings. A farmer asked the blacksmith about a new tool he had been considering. A mother inquired about cloth suitable for a winter cloak. The captain's wife purchased salted fish, explaining that she wanted to keep extra food reserved in case her husband's ship returned later than expected. Mid-morning was the busiest period. The square grew warm as sunlight fell on the stone and wood. A few sellers propped small cloth coverings above their tables to shield themselves from the brightness. The smell of bread, herbs, and fresh vegetables mixed with the faint scent of iron from the blacksmith's bench. By midday, goods began to dwindle. The fisherman sold most of his barrels. The weaver parted with 2 pieces of cloth. The carpenter found homes for several of his bowls in one modest chair. The baker's baskets, once full, were nearly empty. The market never ended abruptly. It simply softened as goods disappeared and people returned to their work. Around this time, many villagers sat near the well with simple lunches. Bread, cheese, and fruit were common choices. They ate slowly, watching the remaining market activity unfold. Conversations continued in quiet tones, as if everyone understood that the event marked a shared pause in their weekly routines. After eating, the blacksmith gathered the few tools that remained unsold or unclaimed. The carpenter tied his unused items into a bundle. The weaver folded her remaining cloth. The baker collected crumbs and closed his baskets. The fisherman prepared his cart for the long journey home. Even the farmers began loading their unsold goods, though most had traded efficiently throughout the morning. Some of them donated extra vegetables to neighbors who were in need. Such gestures were not unusual. Market day was as much about community as it was about trade. As the square emptied, the quiet returned. The stone well stood at the center once more, surrounded by only a few stray leaves and footprints from the morning's crowd. The final bits of conversation faded as villagers stepped away, returning to fields, workshops, and homes. Despite its calm appearance, market day had strengthened the bonds of the village. Goods were exchanged, tools were repaired, and families gathered what they needed to prepare for the coming week. No one expected excitement or spectacle. Instead, they valued routine, familiarity, and the certainty that each week would bring another opportunity to support one another. By the time late afternoon arrived, the village had settled back into its usual rhythm. Work continued. Children played near their homes, and smoke curled from chimneys. Market day had passed, leaving behind a sense of quiet satisfaction and steady cooperation. The square would remain empty until next week, when villagers gathered once again carrying goods, stories, and the subtle hope that the weather, the harvest, and the seasons would continue to guide them with gentle predictability. Domestic crafts, hidden household work in the 1700s. Much of the work that sustained a household happened quietly behind cottage doors. These tasks were rarely celebrated, and they did not draw attention the way market days or blacksmith forges did. Yet domestic crafts formed the backbone of village life. Without them, families could not keep warm, clothed, or fed through the changing seasons. Inside each home, a steady rhythm shaped the day. The work varied depending on the season and the size of the family, but nearly every household performed the same essential tasks. Preparing food, mending clothing, making candles and soap, tending the fire, and keeping tools in usable condition. These responsibilities required patience more than strength, and skill more than speed. The cottage belonging to a young family near the center of the village provided a typical example of this daily work. The mother of the family began her morning while the sky was still a pale gray. She added small pieces of wood to the hearth so that the fire would wake gradually. The warmth helped her prepare breakfast, simple porridge, warmed bread, or occasionally eggs, if the hens had been generous. As the meal simmered over the fire, she checked the pantry, noting what they had left from the previous day. Shelves of preserved fruits, jars of root vegetables, bundles of dried herbs, and sacks of grain filled the space. Much of this food had required long hours of preparation earlier in the year. Drying, storing, and salting had to be done carefully to prevent a single mistake might ruin weeks or months of work. Today, she planned to make a new batch of soap. She moved slowly, there was no need for hurry, and gathered the items she needed. Soap making required ashes from the hearth, animal fat saved from cooking, and water drawn from the well. She mixed the ingredients in a large pot, stirring steadily over low heat. The mixture thickened gradually, filling the cottage with a faint, earthy smell. Soap making was not a daily task, but when it was done, it required uninterrupted focus. She tested the mixture by touching a drop between her fingers, checking consistency. Once it reached the right thickness, she poured it into wooden molds to cool. Later, She would cut it into bars and store them for washing clothes, dishes, and sometimes for bathing when water was warm enough. While the soap cooled, she turned her attention to mending a set of clothes. Her husband's work trousers had worn thin at the knees, and her oldest child had torn a small hole in a sleeve while climbing a tree. She examined each garment in good light near the window. Clothing had to last as long as possible. Fabric was valuable, and buying new cloth was often expensive. She threaded a needle and began stitching slowly. Her hands moved with practiced steadiness, needle in, needle out, pulling the thread taut, but not too tight. These small repairs extended the life of each piece. Sometimes, when clothing became too worn, she cut it into strips to use as cleaning cloths, or she transformed them into patchwork quilts for the winter months. While she sewed, her youngest child played nearby with a wooden spoon and a small bundle of scraps. Domestic life required watching children while tending tasks, and she had learned how to keep them close without disrupting the work. Once the mending was complete, she stepped outside to check the family's small garden behind the cottage. Even a modest garden required daily attention. She weeded around the herbs, checking whether thyme or sage needed gathering. She inspected the vegetables to ensure insects had not caused damage overnight. In the cooler months, she covered delicate plants with woven mats to protect them from frost. The herbs she collected today would be dried and stored for cooking and simple remedies. Many families relied on herbal knowledge to treat common ailments. A pot of mint tea eased stomach discomfort. A paste made from chamomile soothed irritated skin. Though village healers existed, most households had their own modest supply of herbal remedies. After tending the garden, she returned indoors to prepare a midday meal. Domestic crafts often intertwined with cooking. She used vegetables collected earlier and combined them with broth left from the night before. Her husband would return briefly from the fields to eat, and the children needed meals that kept them full through the afternoon. While the soup simmered, she turned her attention to candle making, another essential task. In the corner of the cottage rested a small pot of tallow. She heated it gently over the hearth, watching it melt into a clear liquid. She set out a row of wicks, tied to a wooden rack. Candle making required dipping each wick into the melted fat repeatedly, allowing each layer to cool before the next dip. The process was slow but steady. As she dipped the wicks one by one, the candles grew in thickness. They would not burn as brightly as modern lights, but they would provide enough illumination for winter evenings when daylight faded early. Every household had to keep a supply of candles ready before the cold months arrived. When her husband arrived from the fields, the cottage filled briefly with talk about crops, weather, and small observations from the morning's work. After eating, he returned to the fields, leaving her to finish the candles and tidy the home. Cleaning the cottage was not a separate chore, but a continuous process. Ashes needed clearing from the hearth. Floors were swept with handmade brooms. Pots were scrubbed with sand and water. Domestic crafts depended on maintaining an orderly environment. Clutter made work harder and slowed daily routines. In the afternoon, she tended to the family's wool. Each year, they sheared their small flock of sheep and stored the wool in sacks. She did not own a loom, but she could card the wool, spin it into threads, and trade it with the village weaver for finished cloth. Today, she brushed the wool to straighten it and remove anything stuck in it. Spinning came next. She sat at a small spinning wheel, guiding the fibers into a thin thread. The wheel turned rhythmically, creating a soft hum that filled the room. Spinning took patience. The thread had to be even and strong. She accumulated it slowly on the spindle, knowing each length would eventually help clothe her family. Later in the day, when shadows lengthened outside the window, she began preparing the evening meal. Domestic crafts often ended where they began with food. She collected vegetables from the garden, stirred the stew pot, and checked the bread she had set near the hearth to rise earlier. She shaped the dough and baked it in a small clay oven beside the fire. As evening settled, her husband returned, weary from the fields. The children gathered near the table, and the family ate together. The meal was simple, but warm vegetable stew, bread, and perhaps a small portion of salted meat, if the supply allowed. After dinner, she finished small tasks that required light from the fire. Sometimes she spun more thread. Other times she sewed patches or repaired household items when the children grew sleepy. She tucked them into their straw-filled mattresses and checked that the cooling soap had hardened properly in the molds. Before she finally rested, she banked the hearth fire for the night, adding enough wood to keep it smoldering until morning. The cottage grew quiet. The small tasks of the day, each one minor on its own, had formed another thread in the ongoing fabric of their life. Domestic crafts rarely drew attention, yet they were essential. They kept the home functioning, warm, and orderly. They fed the family, clothed them, and prepared them for the seasons ahead. While other trades shaped the village from the outside, domestic work sustained it from within quietly, steadily, and without pause. Roads, ports, and travelers, merchants, and fisherfolk in the 1700s. The rhythm of a village was shaped not only by farms and workshops, but also by the movement of people beyond its borders. Roads, though rough and narrow, connected communities. Small ports supported the trade of goods that could not be produced locally. Travelers, merchants, fisherfolk, and wandering traders carried news, stories, and essential supplies between distant places. Their journeys were slow, often difficult, but vital for maintaining the village's quiet stability. The main road leading away from the village was a simple dirt path, uneven from years of cartwheels and hooves. During dry months, it was dusty. After rain, it turned muddy and soft. Merchants used this road regularly. They traveled between towns to buy and sell goods, gathering items not available in their own community. One such merchant, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, visited the village every few weeks. He arrived with a small cart pulled by a sturdy horse. Inside the cart, he carried goods that villagers valued, glassware from nearby towns, bolts of cloths dyed in unfamiliar colors, metal tools imported from larger cities, and occasionally spices or sweets that were rare treats. As he approached, villagers recognized the creaking of his cart and the sound of the horse's steady steps. They did not rush to greet him. Instead, they gathered slowly, knowing he would spend hours in the square. The merchant had learned long ago that patience was essential. He greeted each person calmly, answering questions and explaining the origin of his goods. He accepted coins when available, but often traded for items he needed along his route. A farmer might offer grain in exchange for a new metal pot. The weaver might trade finished cloth for needles she could not find locally. The carpenter might purchase metal hinges or a sharper blade for his tools. For the merchant, the road was both workplace and home. He traveled from village to village, sleeping in small inns or, when necessary, under the shelter of his cart. He carried news from neighboring communities, stories of weather, trade, births, and passing travelers. Villagers appreciated these small pieces of information, for news moved slowly, and hearing about distant towns helped them feel connected to a larger world. The road also served travelers who were not merchants. Some were laborers seeking temporary work in busy seasons. Others were peddlers selling small items like ribbons, needles, or simple toys. A few were wanderers who carried nothing more than a walking staff and a modest bag. Though the village did not see strangers often, travelers occasionally appeared, asking for water or a place to rest. Hospitality varied from home to home, but most villagers offered something: a meal, a warm drink, or a corner of the barn for shelter. Beyond the inland roads lay the coastal towns, where ports bustled with the movement of goods and people. The village was not directly on the shore, but its residents often traveled there to trade. The sea shaped life for many people across the region. Fishermen and sailors depended on its waters, while merchants relied on ships to move goods across long distances. Along the coastline, a small fishing community awakened before sunrise each day. Several fishermen lived there, their cottages close to the water's edge. He pushed his boat into the water, stepping aboard with practiced balance. His nets lay neatly folded beside him. He rowed beyond the shallow shoreline, scanning the surface for subtle signs of fish moving beneath. After casting his nets, he waited. The boat drifted slowly, rocking in the mild current. The sky brightened as the sun rose, and seabirds circled overhead. The catch varied from day to day. Some mornings brought abundance, others only enough to feed his family. The rest he packed into barrels with salt, which helped preserve them for sale or trade. Salted fish traveled farther inland and reached villages like the one in our story. The fisherman occasionally traveled there himself, bringing a small cart filled with barrels. He was always welcomed, for his goods helped families prepare meals that lasted through the colder months. The port near the fishing community served a broader purpose. Merchant ships arrived carrying goods from distant towns and sometimes from across the sea. Sailors unloaded crates of spices, tools, fabric, and pottery. Local workers helped move the cargo, storing it in warehouses until traders could distribute it inland. The ships also carried sailors returning home, traders seeking new routes, or migrants searching for a place to settle. The port was never crowded, but its gentle activity brought life to the coastline. Taverns near the docks provided simple meals and places for travelers to rest. Fisherfolk gathered there to share stories, comparing catches, and discussing weather patterns. Occasionally, villagers from inland visited the port. A farmer might accompany a merchant to deliver grain or purchased salt. The blacksmith sometimes traveled to obtain higher quality iron. The baker's family visited to buy sea salt for baking or herbs, brought from foreign shores. For many villagers, trips to the port were rare, but memorable. The smell of the sea, the sight of tall ship masts, and the voices of sailors from distant regions added color to their otherwise quiet lives. Travelers brought more than goods, they brought perspectives. A merchant from a distant town might describe different farming techniques. Sailors shared stories of storms, foreign ports, and calm nights at sea. A wandering craftsman might demonstrate a new method for sharpening blades. These exchanges broadened the villagers' understanding of the world beyond their own fields and forests. Despite the variety of travelers who passed through, the roads and ports remained steady, dependable features of daily life. They allowed goods to circulate, news to spread, and communities to stay connected. Without them, isolated villages would struggle to acquire what they could not produce themselves. As evening arrived, the roads grew quiet again. The merchant packed his cart and prepared to continue his journey the next morning. The fisherman sat near his cottage, mending a net by firelight. The sailors in the port prepared their ships for the next tide. Along the shoreline, waves brushed the sand with their soft, rhythmic sound. Back in the inland village, families prepared for rest. They had traded for fish, tools, or cloth earlier in the day. Their connection to the wider world remained subtle but constanta, thread woven gently into their daily lives. Travelers would come again, bring in new goods and new stories. The roads and ports would continue their steady work, shaping life without demanding attention, and with their quiet influence. Another chapter of ordinary life in the 1700s came to a practical and deeply rooted in the humble movements of people traveling between places. As our journey through the 1700s comes to an end, the village settles into silence once more. The farmer has laid down his tools. The final loaves cool on the baker's table. The blacksmith's forge rests in warm, fading embers, and families across the countryside drift into their nightly quiet. Tonight, we walked through fields, stepped into simple workshops, wandered through markets, and followed travelers along old roads and gentle shores. Together, we saw how ordinary people lived, worked, and moved through the seasons. Slowly, steadily, and without hurry. Their world offered calm by necessity, and for a little while, yours has done the same. If your eyes feel heavy now, let them close softly. Let the quiet of the past guide your breathing, and let your thoughts settle like dust on an old wooden floor. And if you're still awake, you may stay here as long as you wish, in this peaceful space where history becomes a lullaby. As this spoken story ends, gentle, relaxing music will begin to play on its own, carrying you deeper into rest and helping you drift quietly into sleep. Thank you for spending this time with a sleeping historian. Until our next story, sleep well, stay safe, and may calm nights always find you.